Chapter 25. Daruk. The weight of the boulder breaker pulled at Inobo's shoulders, changing the experience of his every movement. The sun was high over Death Mountain, and as he looked back down at Goron City, he realized he had never traveled this far from home before. "Are you all right?" Zelda called from ahead, voice carrying on the wind, and he turned to wave an affirmative and started trotting to catch up. She and Pai had been leading this expedition most of the way, if he was honest. He walked with them until they spotted a nest of monsters. Then they would go ahead and root the monsters out with explosives and ice magic. Then he'd catch up again. There had been a lot of monsters on the trip up here, so even though they needed him with them to give directions, he had been hanging back for a lot of the walk. Even now the two women were surrounded by the telltale evil-looking smoke that signified where a band of moblins had been only minutes before. He had not held the boulder breaker in his hands since leaving Bluto's house. Goron weapons are fascinating. Zelda was kneeling in the middle of the battlefield, examining her cobble crusher. Bluto had always told Yunobo the Hylians couldn't wield Goron weapons, but she could, though, perhaps, not gracefully. Their weight and lack of an edge seemed like they would make them particularly suited to fighting enemies with armor plating, but at the same time it's almost as if they were made for mining. They're almost like hammers. They basically are hammers. Goro. Stopping next to Zelda, he squatted, pointing at the pitted edges in the metal of her weapon. "See these? Heavy impact. The boss doesn't like it much, but if any of the guards ever want to make a few extra rupees, they'll find a mineral deposit and crack it open. So they are used for mining, too. If they don't rely on the fineness of a cutting edge, then I suppose the standards for maintenance must be very different, too." He nodded, and she grinned, not the way she had beamed at him back at the northern mine, but a different sort. She really liked to learn things, to figure out the way they worked. And, on top of that, she was really good at filling a silence or at getting him to talk. The differences in our strengths inform so much about how differently we live and build, don't they? They were quick to react. That was as far as he got before Pai and Zelda both looked at him. They were good at keeping up the charade, but not when he surprised them. Well, he couldn't blame them, neither was he. "Listen, I wanted to ask the two of you a couple of things, before we get to the top of the mountain. Goro." He held up his hands, anticipating a question. "Not about how to handle the divine beast or anything. I figure you two must be experts. But, Oh, man, this was hard. Way harder than it ought to be. And why should it be this hard? What kind of Goron, what kind of man was he if he couldn't work up the nerve to ask questions? He was regretting this already. He should pretend he'd never said anything. Maybe he could tell them he forgot what he was going to ask, and then... "It's okay." Pai's voice was gentle. The sight of her standing against the backdrop of Death Mountain, cinders filling the space around her silver hair, was more calming than he would have thought. "Take your time. It's all right to be nervous about important questions." Zelda nodded in turn. "All right. Ein." He took a second to breathe, to think of the way he was supposed to be, found that didn't help at all. So, he'd be like a rock. Rocks didn't feel embarrassment, didn't feel shame, didn't feel fear. Be a rock? Rocks didn't ask questions, though not perfect. Well, he'd push through it as best he could. Those things that the boss said, back at his house, Goro. He thought starting would make the rest easier, but it didn't. No rock rolling down a hill. Bluto's a good Goron and he watches out for everyone. What? All that stuff, Goro. Being proud of me, and how things weren't fair. He doesn't talk like that. Not ever. Not once. The other things, about having power meaning I don't have a choice. He's never said those things either, but he said things like them, Goro. But the others, no. So, I was wondering, Goro, while I was out, did you talk to him? Zelda and Paya looked at each other again, not a stolen glance to make sure the other was still there but a long, taking in sort of look where they communicated something that he couldn't understand. After a time, they broke it off and Zelda said, "We did." Oh. He didn't know what he was expecting. Really? Well, no, he had been expecting almost exactly that answer. He could almost hear the entire thing, everything that must have been said. Zelda snapping at Bluto being so sullen and surly, the bits and barbs that hadn't made sense to him at the time. If he thought about it, really thought about it, he could probably reconstruct that conversation.
Sorry.
Zelda slowly got to her feet, lifting her cobble crusher off the ground and turning to put it against her back. Yunobo rose, too, hefting it higher and then tying it in place for her, positioning it so it wouldn't bang against her trident while she walked.
To tell you the truth, Yunobo, we didn't actually want you to come with us on this expedition.
Eh?
Why not, Guru? Because you had just been through something terrible. If I hadn't been there, your injuries would have taken weeks to heal, if they ever healed at all.
He cinched the knot in the rope, patting the weapon with his fingers, and she shifted her shoulders to test the tie.
Thank you, that's very good. Anyway, yes, we talked to Bluto extensively. He insisted that you had to come with us, because you are descended from Lord Daruk and it was your right and your duty to.
She stopped, and he noticed that her fists were shaking just thinking about it, enough that he could see it through her gauntlets.
I swear, it's as if that man had never spoken to anyone who was willing to give him a piece of their mind.
That was probably true.
What did you say to him, Guru?
When Zelda didn't answer, he looked at Paya, whose color rose before she turned away.
That bad? Ah? Yes, that bad. Because it's not fair to you, and Yunobo, it's not my place to care about these things on your behalf, but I care a great deal about fairness. About being given the opportunity to make choices, even if they are not really choices. We have to believe we're the arbiters of our own destinies, or we can't understand ourselves at all.
He couldn't imagine what sort of tongue-lashing would be up to the challenge of making Bluto consider his words more carefully, and was glad that he had been unconscious for it. But, still, something in the way Zelda said that, the way she was talking about the importance of choice and its intersection with destiny. He looked down at her hip, steeled himself.
My other question is, who are you two, Uru?
She tried not to show the sudden tension in her back, but was visible even through the flamebreaker armor. Paya didn't betray herself quite so readily, but that was because her blush hadn't faded and she was just staring at the sky.
You're here to stop the divine beasts. You've apparently already done it with at least one other, and I don't know many Hylians, but the two of you are awfully young to have all these heavy experiences and thoughts on destiny. Go! You fight like nobody I've ever seen. You managed to stop all the sentries without using cannons. I'm pretty sure you're carrying a Shiga slate. You managed to shame the boss. It's a lot, Uru. Not to mention that when you're around other people, Zelda, you do all the talking, and Paya barely says a word. You behave like a knight and a squire, almost.
That made Paya's color rise even more, so she was definitely still listening.
So, who are you, Uru? I'm not that young.
Zelda turned on her heel to look up at him, and even from inside of her helmet the force of her eyes was like a slap across the face.
I'll have you know, I'm over 100 years old. What? Wait, how long do Hylians live, Uru? I knew you were older than me, but...
Something in her face made him stop, and he actually took a step back. He didn't know what he was feeling, though perhaps Prince Scion could have told him.
You know the story of the champions and the calamity. How the champions of Hyrule fought against the calamity and died, and the princess disappeared.
Golden hair, Sheikah slate magic, light blue eyes can yell at the boss. Holy gravel. He looked back at Paya and pointed at Zelda with one finger unmouthed.
She's that Zelda?
And Paya nodded and he thought his head was going to explode. Zelda turned away from him, looking to the top of the mountain.
All of them died for me, Yunobo, because I failed them. The Hylian champion, Link, is still fighting Ganon in the heart of Hyrule Castle. I don't know if you've heard that story, but it's true. I've seen it.
She lifted her helmet, rubbed at her eyebrows with her fingertips.
We are gathering the divine beasts to aid the hero, Bart. The champion's spirits are trapped in their divine beasts. More than to aid the hero, more than to defeat Ganon, I want to set them free.
He was finding he could process this more quickly and easily than he would have thought.
Wait, Lord Daruk's up there? Yes. Ganon's power imprisoned him and the other champions at the moment of their deaths. And...
She breathed slowly, trying not to show weakness.
I have forgotten nearly all of my past life. I remember the champions in fits and starts, as people and places help me to recall them. I remember Lord Daruk. He cared for me fiercely, though I could not see it. I did not love him well enough in return.
Another pause.
This is why I didn't want you to come, Yunobo. Haya and I have seen and experienced and fought such horrible things on our journey, and none worse than the blight sitting on the divine beasts. The champions died for me. But it was their choice. Maybe they would have said there was no other choice to be made, and maybe they would have been right, but they still made that choice. No one forced it upon them. They were willing to die because they were courageous.
The question seemed obvious. He cleared his throat, sniffed, wiped at his eyes.
Did you ever have a choice, Thor?
Another pause.
In my old life, I would have said no. Nah. I hope so.
She put her helmet back on.
You don't have to come with us, you know, Bo. Derek would be sick with anger if he knew you were being coerced to risk your life by someone you loved and trusted, instead of taking on that task for yourself. So, I would prefer it if you stayed here. I understand you can't return to the city, but we can make it the rest of the way up the mountain, and after Varudonia is tamed we will come back to you.
He found himself sputtering, not caring that he sounded ridiculous.
What, but, I just stay here, Burrow. After all this, Daruk's up there. Everyone's counting on me. I have to help you. If you help us,
Zelda said, and now she was bowing to him.
I hope that it will be because it was your decision, and not anyone else's.
Zelda and Paya turned away from him, then, and continued up the trail to the peak. He was left watching them, his thoughts smashing into each other so that he couldn't hear any over the cacophony of the others, couldn't even figure out what he was feeling. The boulder breaker pulled at his shoulders. The wave of heat coming out of the mouth of Death Mountain was a hand pushing at their torsos as Zelda and Paya came to the lip of the volcano. Zelda was in front, hand braced against one of the rocks to keep her balance, and Paya came up beside her. Beneath them Varudonia rested, legs settled deep in the roiling magma pool. The red light of the mountain's hot made it look almost serene, creating an illusion that the divine beast gently breathed as it slept. It was not sleeping, they knew, and would soon be on the move again. Zelda was now holding the power, trying to avoid detection by the blight until the last moment, but even from hundreds of meters up they could feel the stirring of the mighty shadow. It waited for them. They looked at each other, nodded, leaped together into the open air, the heat pushing up at them, and then opened their paragliders to begin their long trip down. Zelda pulled hard on one side of her paraglider, forcing the nose down into a controlled descent. The updraft was horrendous, threatening to tear the handles from her grip, and she could barely afford to glance at Paya to make sure they were still at the same level. And, yes, Paya was still in control, her face a neutral mask of concentration as the cords in her neck stood out with the effort of holding steady. Varudonia was a silhouette against the light of the magma. She could see that the armor on its entire back half was cracked, stressed nearly to the point of shattering. Well, good thing its cannon isn't in its tail. She wanted to be glib. It would be ridiculous to give it more thought, but she also felt a pang, looking at it. 10,000 years that had spent whole, ready to divulge so many secrets, and she had as good as destroyed it because she couldn't think of a better way to deal with it. How much longer would it last in that state? Decades? Years? Less? And when it crumbled, she would be the one to blame. The air shifted, a pressure at her ears like the beating of a mighty heart. The blight was calling to her. It did not know where she was. She was hiding herself, and Paya well enough to be sure of that, but that she was there it was sure. The fire blight. Then, beneath that, far deeper than a physical sensation, she felt a mighty upheaval, the straining of a continent against the chains that would seek to bind it. Daruk. The fire blight would be ready as soon as they set foot on Varudonia. It would not give them time to join with Daruk. It would be on the attack instantly. Paya would not be able to hold it off by herself, not in truth. If she used more of the goddess's power, she could restrain it until the moment was right, but that much strength would bring the calamity's wrath down on them, and that would cause a full eruption of Death Mountain. She could not begin to imagine the catastrophe. So, it had to be a surprise. Paya. The other women did not look to her, but she could tell Paya heard her because of how she reacted when Zella continued, "I'm dropping now." "What?" Paya's answer was nearly a shriek. "Zelda, please, I don't know what you're thinking, but trust me." Zelda shouted over the wind. "Maintain your current rate of descent. If it looks like something is going wrong,
I'll trust you to handle the changing situation. But for right now, I need to get the drop on Ganon, and this is the only way. Please, wait a second. Zelda. Zelda.
She collapsed her paraglider, and as gravity pulled her into freefall she grabbed hold of the power. The ringing of a bell filled the heart of the mountain, red light drowned in gold, and beneath her the firelight stirred. Gorons were born of the stone. Daruk could have told that to anyone who asked, but he believed it, too. The Zora were water, the Hylians were soil, the Gerudo were sand, the Rito were wind, and the children of the forest? Well, that explained itself, didn't it? But the Gorons were stone. Solid. Stolid. Powerful. Ancient. That was the Gorons. When he had died, Daruk had never lost consciousness. He suspected that had been true of all the champions, but for him it was a fact. One moment he'd been bleeding out on the floor, Ganon's ridiculous monster standing over him with that gaudy axe. In the next moment he'd been here, in this vast dark place, with chains holding him down against a firmament colder and harder than any rock he'd ever seen. And, sure, maybe they hadn't been real chains. That was just how his mind interpreted them. And he had to admit that at first, he'd struggled something fierce, pulling against his bonds so hard that if they had been chains he would have broken them into itty-bitty pieces. But when he realized that wasn't going to work, that he was really and truly trapped, he'd stopped pulling and he'd started waiting. Nobody liked to talk about it much, because it was easier to show off to the other peoples if you were loud and strong and knew it and let them know it. But the foremost of Goron virtues wasn't strength, it was patience. So, he waited. And he waited. And he waited. The other champions were out there, too. He could feel them, very distant, trapped like he was. He couldn't reach out to them, couldn't call out so they could hear him, couldn't tell them it would be alright and to hang on. He hoped they knew anyway. He wasn't the most sensitive of the champions. He was probably the least, so it was a pretty good bet that they could feel the same absence he did. Mipha, Revali, Urbosa, they were all bound like this. But not Link. Not Zelda. And then, one day, after a long time waiting, Mipha's chain snapped. Not all at once. First there was a light, so bright he could see it all the way from where he was, and then a sound like a bell ringing. Then the chain snapped, and he could see the frayed ends stretching off into infinity as the Calamity threw an oversized tantrum. But the point was, Mipha was free. He could feel that she was free, standing atop the mountain, watching something. Probably the little guy, knowing her. But his patience was paying off. Even if he was the very last, it would just be a matter of time. Though, he waited. But, well, even rocks could get a little impatient, right? A little fidgety. He could feel his time coming to an end, and his anticipation set his blood on fire. In the scheme of things, he wasn't waiting much longer before a light broke through the darkness above him, all gold and fire and warmth, and he could feel her there, too. She was different somehow, brighter, less weighed down, but it was Zelda. Her power reached out to him, and he felt so many bindings break. Not the heaviest, not the worst of them. He was still held fast, but he could move, just a little. He could reach out with his hand, seeking that brilliance. Daruk. She even sounded different. Still a Kate, but so much more level. She'd been through a lot. Daruk, reach for me. In the darkness he grinned as if she even had to ask. The goddess's power blossomed in the air above Vah Rudania, too close, falling too fast, to bring the wrath of the divine beast against it. The darkness driving that beast was reduced to a single option. It heaved, and the fire beneath Vah Rudania roared to life, and the world quaked beneath it. Power gathered, and darkness, and fire, a maelstrom of force and malevolence that would hurt the eye to look at. The entrances of Vah Rudania remained open. The darkness invited the goddess in, knowing not fear, nor even caution. It grew, and grew, and grew, the power gathering into a mass that hissed and bubbled and spat, a ball of malice whose eyes would have given a Hinnock's paws. Cloven hoof smashed into the floor, splintering the stone beneath lakes that would have served as pillars in blasphemous temples. Arms reached out, thick-muscled, burning with malice, hands dense like carved boulders. When the thing stood tall it was no less massive, its frame rectangular and powerful as if mocking a Goron's, and though its arms and legs were armored its torso was bare, inviting a blade, challenging its attackers. It raised its head, and into the armored plating of its mask were cut two eyes. The field of fire that served as its hair flowed down over its wide shoulders, and it had no horns, only two small, triangular ears, between which was nestled a crown of shadows that blinded the eye, defying sight. The goddess's power descended. Varadonia shook at the impact as the figure landed on their feet, sinking into a squat before rising to their full height. The princess, yes, but more than she, there was a flashing to any eye that looked, so that she and another figure were occupying the same space, and this other figure was mountainous, thick-limbed, wide-grinning, eyes burning with a long-held anticipation. The Fireblight knew that figure, didn't know that this was the dead's grudge, finding form against it. The light-enshrouded figure pointed at the darkness-enshrouded beast, and the Fireblight flinched.
"All right, bruise him."
Dark's shout filled the divine beast, the air around it, the whole of the volcano. The Fireblight bared its weapon, an enormous axe of burning blue light materializing at the end of its arm. The champion reached over his shoulder, easily hoisting the cobble crusher in one hand.
"Round 2!"
the Fireblight roared. Yunobo nearly lost his footing as the mountainside heaved under him. Pinwheeling his arms to keep his balance, he found himself turning, trying to look up at the summit. He hadn't moved from the spot where Zelda and Paya had left him. He hadn't wanted to move. Well, no. He had wanted to move. He'd wanted to go up there and help them, or else go back down the mountain and hide, maybe? Just keep going, on past Goron City, out into the lowlands, never to return? He could carry his shame with him and hide from other Gorons. Maybe change his name. Live a peaceful life. It sounded better, at least, than standing still on a mountain, torn between what he should be doing versus what he should also be doing. Smoke bellowed from the mouth of Death Mountain, and with that smoke a roar. He'd heard Varudonia's voice more times than he could count, and whatever was making this sound now. It wasn't as big as Rudonia, but he understood on a deep, almost reflexive level that it was actually worse. There was something behind that sound, a malice, that made him suddenly remember dreams from when he'd been small and afraid of being pulled underground and not being able to get out. That was what that roar sounded like, the thing that would pull him underground. Zelda was up there, and so was Paya, and they said Dirk was there, too. Paya was wild with a sword, and Zelda was probably getting ready to fight the calamity itself, and Daruk was. Well, he was Daruk. If the three of them worked together, what chance did any monster have? None. None, pretty much. But the roar was long and loud, and the mountainside continued to shake, and Yunobo had this image in his head, all of a sudden, of Zelda and Paya and Daruk sinking into the ground. For some reason he could barely see Daruk, but he could see Paya clawing desperately at the ground, panic in her eyes before the stone rose to cover her. Zelda looked back at him, and she was bathed in golden light, and she reached out to him, extending her hand, and he thought, "If I try to help I will be dragged down too," and the golden light was swallowed up by the dark. If he'd had anything on his stomach he would have thrown it up. He wasn't prepared for that kind of thing, but it was true, too, wasn't it? Why wasn't he up there now? Because he was scared?
"If I go up there, I might get in the way. Never mind them dying because I am not helping. Goro, they might die because I make a mistake."
Instantly, the rebuttal came unbidden from his own mouth.
"What? I think I can really get in the way? If worse comes to worse, I'll huddle up in a corner with Dark's protection. Kara! I'm scared because I don't know how not to be. That's not wrong. That's not an excuse. Kara! What would Bluto ask? I don't care what Bluto would say."
The rumbling of the mountain faded to a deep, pensive hum. Yunobo's eyes returned to the peak.
"I don't care if it's what a Goron should be doing. If it's manly, Goro. If it's what people expect of me. I can't leave them up there. They're my friends, and I haven't known them very long, but I can't leave my friends up there, Goro." Zelda wanted to make sure it was my choice, for my reasons, but I don't care about the reasons, or the choice. I just care about them.
Oh, he ran. Dark swung in a low horizontal sweep, and the Fireblight moved a block, too slow, not braced solidly enough, unable to turn aside the blood that smashed into his diaphragm, bending its torso like a sack of sand before it went flying, smashing into one of the walls that marked the boundaries of Varudonia's back. No hesitation, no planning, Daruk charged. The fireblade struggled to its feet, the fire of its eyes flaring so that the air around it grew darker. It hurled the malice at him, a wave of decay. The wave crashed upon Daruk's protection and broke, barely making the surface of the barrier flash. Daruk allowed himself a small, tight smile. Yeah, this was worlds better than fighting this creep unarmed had been. It was big enough to still put up a fight, but nothing like what he dealt with before. When he got within striking distance, he stepped in hard with his left foot, pushing off with his right, rotating from his hips. The entire body was too small, too thin, almost sickly, but the legs were the right length and that could make up for a lot. As he swung, the cobble crusher smashed into the fireblade's barrier. The impact sent shockwaves up the metal of the weapon. He could hear it straining, and his hands nearly went numb as his shoulders threatened to seize.
Oh, right. I forgot you're a thief on top of everything else. You haven't got even an ounce of pride, eh?
The fireblade did not answer. The barrier winked out and Ganon dissolved into strings of blue light that twisted and danced through the air. If it was moving like that, it was going to be a short-range leap, which meant... He threw up his barrier as the fireblade reappeared and screamed, launching a fireball nearly the size of its own body. He turned to face it, face up, and saw that it was not just fire. Something swam in the fire, some dark shape that gave the impression of watchfulness, and at the last second he realized it was an eye, an incarnation of the malice itself. He clenched his teeth, squeezed his shoulder blades together, and centered himself. The force of the fireball striking Daruk's protection and exploding was so immense that it tore Pai's paraglider from the grip of her right hand. She plummeted the last 6 meters, letting go of the paraglider at the last second so that she could hit the surface of Vorudonia with a loose roll, before collecting herself. Automatically she grabbed her paraglider, folded it, returned it to its place on her back. Then she allowed herself to turn back to the battle. The effect of seeing Daruk and Zelda in the same space was bizarre. The princess had been taller than Mipha, and their limbs had different proportions, but they'd still been of a size. Daruk was nearly twice Zelda's height and must have been over a dozen times her mass, and the effect was only barely mitigated by how much sadder Zelda looked in the Flamebreaker armor. She was not even sure whether the weapon was being held in Zelda's hand or in Daruk's. It was as if its position depended on how she was seeing them in that moment, like reality itself was flitting back and forth. Compared to Mipha, Daruk's style lacked utterly in subtlety but not in elegance. Every movement was sure and practiced and fluid, the result of years of focused practice. But there were no such things as feints or parries or even avoidance anywhere in the Goron's huge, all-or-nothing swings. His blows were so crushing that the fireblade was forced to engage him on his terms, so the two of them stood there, legs planted, swinging weapons larger than Hylians with enough force to topple buildings. Every time they clashed, the sound was like the largest anvil in the world, and above it all Daruk was laughing.
Come on. Is that all you've got? Where are the fire bats? The light beams? Has the mighty Daruk already got you on the ropes? Haven't you been eating your gravel?
The fireblade's eyes flared and its hair stood nearly on end, and then it reared back, grasping its enormous axe hand with its free arm. Daruk's swing caught it in the ribs, and there was a crunch and a spurt of fire and malice as its ribs broke and the bone tore at its flesh, but it did not move. With an effort that Pai could not begin to imagine, it recentered its stance, shifted its shoulders, and brought its axe down. The blue blade skidded against the surface of Daruk's protection. The loss of its intended momentum made the blade bounce, throwing the fireblade off balance as Daruk spun, braining around the cobble crusher in a whirlwind's arc. The fireblade threw up its shield, but it seemed that the champion had predicted this. In the brief moment that she saw his face, Daruk was grinning. The cobble crusher slammed into the shield, shivered, and then burst into a hail of burning shards that filled the air before fading to cinders. Haya was already running while Daruk was staring at his hands and shouting,
"What do you mean they gave you a used one? Don't people take care of their chills anymore?"
She ran low to the ground, and the goddess' blessed sword and shield were in her hands when the fireblade's barrier came down. Too focused on Zelda, on Daruk, it didn't know she was there until her sword had sunk 4 times into the flesh of its calves and thighs. It screamed, and stomped, and she retreated and circled. The waterblade had taught her that shallow cuts would do precious little, but puncturing its flesh would still make the manifestation of Ganon stagger. Sidon had managed it, and so had Mipha. In theory she should be able to do the same. That thought was folly, and she knew that in an indirect way as the monster wheeled on her, a shadow that made Lionel seem tame and small in comparison. She brought her shield up, crouching behind it to mask that her position was shifting to dash away. Later she would reflect that this was the only reason she survived what came next. It threw the malice at her, as the water blight had, but it did not attack her as if she were an insect to be brushed away. It struck at her as if she were a champion. She felt it coming as all living things would feel Ganon's approach, and she ducked behind her shield. There was an eruption there, an explosion of force and heat and pain, and the blow on Vauruta had been so heavy that it had thrown her bodily, but this poured around the edges of her shield and grabbed hold of her thus like a cat snatching a butterfly out of the air. Fire, then, and loneliness, and pain like she had never been able to imagine in her entire life, deeper than physical agony. Her mind was a room, carefully organized, and the malice was a burning beast that rampaged through it, destroying everything it touched, putting to the torch her sense of self, her ability to focus. There was a core of the golden strength that Zelda had given her all those weeks ago, held like a precious jewel, something to be protected. Did it want that? No. It was reaching for her memories, for her thoughts of her grandmother, of her village, of her princess. Ah! She grabbed hold of the golden power for herself, that smallest sliver of it, felt it resonating with the weapon and the shield that she held. Out. It was gone, as if it had never been there, leaving her thoughts clean and empty of its influence so that she came crashing back to her bodily awareness. And instantly she launched herself to the side, landing on her shoulder as the axe sank deep into the floor where she had been crouching a moment before. She was on her feet instantly, sword held out, tip pointed constantly at the face of the monster whose eyes were tracking her every movement. That was the first moment she realized how badly Ganon, the calamity, wanted her. Not her, the guardian of the princess, but her, Paya, in particular. Daruk's massive arms wrapped around the Fireblight's torso, squeezing out the fresh torrent of fire and blood and malice from the wound in its side, and Ganon's roar was so pained that Paya had to fight the urge to cover her ears as Daruk twisted and bodily threw it across the arena. It landed with a crash, limbs flailing, pain driving it temporarily to distraction. Paya stepped close to Daruk, sword and shield in an orthodox position again. "You okay, kid?" Daruk's voice was deep, thundering, and comforting, in a way that she'd never thought of a man's voice, not even Dorian's. He sounded like he knew things would be alright. "I'll be fine. I'm still ready to fight." "Dunno about that." She looked up at him, but he was still staring at the Fireblight, and there was strain in his voice even though his grin hadn't shifted. "I'm gonna be honest, I'm a better fighter than that thing is, but without a weapon I couldn't kill it even 100 years ago, when it was a lot punier. How confident are you that you can kill it with your knife there?" She shook her head, and he just nodded. "Yeah, thought not. Easy to see you're a real fighter, but if we're going to put that thing down we'll need to overwhelm it. If you want to turn tail, now's the time." The Fireblight got to its feet, and she could see the wound in its side closing as it turned slowly, deliberately, to face them. She sank into an offensive stance. "I won't run." "Yeah. There. All right. We'll make it work. I'll see if I can pin it, then you open its throat. We'll just need to get an opportunity." Until that moment the Fireblight had not been fighting in truth. That was the only reason Paya could interpret the way that it exploded into flames, jets of fire that snaked through the air like images of dragons spewing malice from their mouths. They were everywhere, each as large around as the blight itself, and they wheeled and twisted skyward. The roar of the fire was deafening before they plunged toward Paya and the dead champion. For once, she had no idea what to do. Then Daruk was in front of her, and his protection was thrown up in a crystalline sphere. The fire smashed into it from a dozen angles, obscuring the rest of the world in inferno, and the noise was so all-consuming she couldn't hear the words of encouragement that Daruk was trying to shout to her. Within the barrier she stood with Daruk, and without the barrier there was light, and heat, and noise, as if the world had ended. Then darkness broke the uniformity of the light as the blight crashed into the barrier. She screamed out of reflex as its axe came smashing down, over and over, the force of the rebound being turned into a more incessant chop, the blade of its weapon showing no strain as its hooves scrabbled and kicked with force that made the stone underneath them splinter and shift. The fire faded, but Ganon was worse, furious. Berserk, squealing and howling in rage and fury and hate so deep that she wouldn't have been able to fathom it except that it had touched her mind a minute before. "Kid, Daruk shouted as Ganon pounded its fist on the red light, alternating blows between its axe and its hand with wild swings that had it rotating its entire torso non-stop.
You still with me? Why yes. Good. Now, listen. I can keep this thing off us for a while, but eventually it will break through.
Did she imagine that there was a crack in the surface of the shield, where its axe kept striking, over and over, with such precision?
Sooner rather than later, probably. The only thing I can do here is control when the shield goes down. So, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to count off the blows it does with its fist. Just before the 10th one lands, I'm going to drop the shield. It's going to hit me, but I don't want you losing your nerve when that happens. Okay. It's going to be ugly, but if I understand what others told me, then Myth's power will keep us safe for that one blow. I'm going to use that chance to pin it. You be ready to open it up. Got it? Yes.
She was not imagining the crack under its axe, nor the one under its fist. In another few minutes it would be through. What would it look like when its fist came through and plowed into the side of Daruk's, Zelda's, head? Would the armor crumple? How much more terrible than the flash of the bombs, and sailing through the air? Oh, she could not take it. Impossible.
Yes. I'll be ready. Ah. Spoken like a true Goron.
He turned his attention back to the firelight, which was screaming its fury into his face through the thinness of the barrier.
All right. I'm gonna start counting. Remember, I'm dropping on 10. 1, 2.
And the rhythm of the fist was like the rhythm of a heartbeat. She could hear it, water dripping after rainfall, ripples in a pool, her grandmother clapping her hands to teach her how to place her feet.
3, 4, 5.
He missed a beat. She looked up, saw that he was also looking up.
Hold that thought.
By an exertion she did not fully understand, Daruk heaved against the interior of the protection, rotating it as he stepped carefully across the floor. She stepped quickly to stay next to him, not sure if she would simply pass through the inner side of the barrier or not, and only looked up again when he stopped moving.
What are you?
Above and behind the firelight, at the very lip of the cliff above them, so small it was barely visible, a red light was falling. It shone against the brightness of the sky, a ruby spinning in the air. And, if she listened very, very carefully, she could hear its panic screaming. Yunobo hadn't really meant to put up Daruk's protection as soon as he jumped. That had just sort of happened, like when you close your eyes when something is about to collide with your face. His whole body was about to collide with molten lava, so that made sense. Really, it wasn't any different than being fired out of a cannon, except that in those cases Bluedo had been the one determining trajectory and making sure he wouldn't miss. He'd had to eyeball this, based on his knowledge of how much faster his downward acceleration was. His only experience that would help him out was his experience falling. And he was an expert at falling, really, so it should be fine. And, well, he couldn't force himself to be ashamed of the screaming. Who wouldn't scream, really? So, he fell, blind, rolled into a ball, spinning, unable to tell up from down or left from right, and every second he was falling faster. He didn't know how far he'd have to fall for Daruk's protection to give out, but he was pretty sure this wasn't it. Though if he hit the lava and ended up plunging down into it, too far away to reach any of the walls, it wouldn't matter anyway. So, good. He'd decided on a course of action and taken it. No point worrying about it now. Still screaming, though. Just as he became reasonably sure that he had been falling for slightly too long, that after slightly too longer he would be falling out of the frying pan and into the fire, he wished that was funnier to him. He came to a sudden, noisy, bone-crunching stop. He could feel his brain slamming against the inside of his skull. Yep, he'd been traveling faster than Bluedo had ever launched him out of a cannon. Whatever he hit was so solid that he bounced off it, but had enough give that he crashed onto the ground a few meters away instead of ricocheting off and being flung into the lava anyway. He hit the ground and Daruk's protection popped out of existence. Dip. Still in one piece. Whatever that crunching sound had been, it hadn't been his bones. What if it was somebody else's bones? He immediately leaped to his feet and his vision went black from the blood rushing out of, or two, he forgot which caused it, his head, but he still looked around, eyes wide.
Oh, maybe I did hit my head. Goro.
He was standing on the back of Varudanya, which he'd never done before. Hai was staring at him with a look of perfect open-mouthed shock, which, good, He hadn't hit her, but what really got him was when he looked at Zelda. He was pretty sure he had a concussion, but if he was seeing Zelda and Daruk standing in the same place, then it must have been a bad one. Okay. Well, he was pretty sure he hadn't hit Pyre or Zelda, and Daruk was already dead. Then he looked over to the left and saw a monster the size of his own house, spewing fire and darkness out of winds that would have killed any Goron, its pain and fury driving it to beat its limbs against the stone of Varudonia, pounding it into finer and finer gravel with every impact. Its entire torso was caved in, nearly crushed flat, and it looked like it was trying to roar but could not.
Oh, the underground thing. Yep, Guru, I see. Daruk.
Zelda looked up, or Daruk did. Whichever. Yunobo unslung the boulder break from his back, hefted it, and tossed it through the air.
Fetch!
With one hand and perfect confidence they reached out, catching hold of the boulder breaker's grip with a familiarity so profound it bordered on intimacy. That was nice. That was very nice. Yunobo then gladly fainted.
Covered the kid.
Before the words were even out of Daruk's mouth, the Shaker girl had already crossed the distance to the Goron youth, and he was a good, honest-looking kid. Never mind how out of his mind he'd have to be to jump down here just to deliver a weapon, leaving Daruk holding his old friend in his hands. Oh, it felt exactly the way he remembered it. Exquisitely balanced, absurdly heavy, utterly impractical for anyone who wasn't as strong as him. It was perfect. Tiny princess, he thought, at Ratty. Are you sure about this? Her reply wasn't disbelieving, exactly, but that she felt the need to ask the question was perfectly fair. Even now the firelight was getting to its feet, pounding at its chest and back with its forearms as if beating its torso back into shape and succeeding. Ganon saw him, saw the weapon he held in his hand, and it must have recognized genuine quality Goron craftsmanship because it instantly put up its barrier, a blood-red jewel that was nearly opaque in the light of the volcano.
Course I'm sure,
he said out loud, because of course she could hear that too.
That thing's shield is no slouch, but it's just a pale imitation of the original. Now I'm going to show you why.
Way down deep, beneath the surface of the place that Daruk had been allowed to occupy, he felt Zelda grab hold of something way bigger than he was. 4 steps back, and then he began to run. He could sprint like no other Goron who'd ever lived, and he could feel the power of that momentum transferring to the boulder breaker as he began to swing. Momentum carried him forward and spun him around, and he always kept his eyes on his target. The pull of the boulder breaker as it sped up pushed his grip to its limit. He could feel the heat building up as it blazed through the air. Ganon's eye wasn't on him, it is on the weapon, and that was satisfying on 2 levels. First, because it meant it knew what was coming, and second, because it was too stupid to realize that the weapon was only as destructive as the spirit that drove it. He was a cyclone, and on the last spin he brought the boulder breaker up in an overhanded chop. The firelight shield shattered, disappearing into spinning shards of light. The boulder breaker came down on top of the monster's head, cracking the armored mask in half, and didn't stop until it smashed into the floor with an impact that shook Varudonia and the mountain it stood in. Then the world was drowned in the chiming of a bell. After nearly 2 hours of paint walking, his back protesting every step, Bluto stood at the top of the hill overlooking Goron City. Not for the first time, he was looking at the peak of Death Mountain. For a long time he stood there, wondering, waiting, unmoving. He did not understand what it meant when Death Mountain shone with golden light, like a beacon calling out to the gods, or why that light brought tears unbidden to his eyes. Well, no one else could see. Didn't really matter, then. Zelda came back to herself, collapsing to her knees. The fireblight Ganon was already dissolving in front of her. There was nearly nothing left of it. Ganon is coming, she said, or tried to say, because of course the calamity was coming now.
Hold on to something.
Daruk's voice echoed from everywhere on Varudonia.
I know the drill. Don't worry, the mighty Daruk isn't letting anything happen to any of us.
Without thinking, without searching for handholds, Zelda sprinted toward Paya and Yunobo. Paya was doing her best to hold the unconscious Goron in place, but he weighed so much that when Varudonia shifted it would be impossible. It doesn't matter. You've already used the power. Put it to work. She was shining when she threw one arm around Paya and the other on top of Yunobo, enshrouding all three of them in the goddess's power, holding them fast as Varudani heaved beneath them. Her goddess awareness pushed out. She could feel Paya's sustained panic, her shivering as the divine beast began to scale the interior of the volcano, so that Zelda's power was holding them in place against a perfectly smooth, perfectly vertical surface.
"Ah, what'd you do to Varudania? Its legs are all busted. It can barely move."
She didn't answer. There would be time for answers later. Instead, she tore her awareness away from Paya, away from Yunobo, away from Death Mountain entire, and threw it outward, toward Hyrule Castle, feeling for the unleashed power of the calamity as its fury was made manifest. Varudani crested the side of the volcano, hoisting itself atop the massive rocks that ringed the mountain's peak, planted its feet to give itself a stable firing platform, and its head opened like a blossoming flower. Its capacitors charged in moments, its targeting laser flashing out, seeking.
"Tiny princess."
She did not answer. For one brief, wild moment, she considered throwing the fullness of her awareness at the castle itself. The sky was clear, or as clear as it ever got on Death Mountain. When Daruk continued, he was equal parts confused and disappointed.
"What's going on?" I wish I knew."
The power of the goddess echoed across the being of the calamity, and in the depths of Hyrule Castle it screamed in pain and an ever-growing fury. The sheer force of its roar drove the hero back, sword held up defensively, and that was the chance that it needed. It gathered its power, standing at the center of a maelstrom of darkness as a mass that suffused that chamber was drawn into it. The air crackled, filling the arena with thunder as Ganon's eyes flashed red and gold and it opened its mouth to roar its hatred. 3 times it had done this, 3 times it had released its fury in the midst of the battle, hurling burning, smothering death across the continent as if it were tossing a ball. 3 times its fury had been thrown at the presence of the goddess, and even if it had not killed her, then 3 times had Hyrule shattered under its ministrations. 3 times, that is how many times it took the hero to learn. The calamity had turned its face skyward, mouth wide open, ready to vomit its hate, when the Master Sword plunged into its throat. The sound of the sword's power ringing out was louder than its choked agony, grander than the spewing fire and malice exploding from his neck in a torrent that parted around the hero, destroying the walls behind him. Link planted his feet on the calamity's shoulders, shifted his grip, and pulled up with the blade of the sword. The calamity's head was pulled even further back as he opened it up from the base of its throat to its chin, kicking off of its head and pulling the sword free as he jumped over it, behind it. The hero landed on the floor behind Ganon as the full force of its power was released in a hellish storm spewing from its wounded throat. The walls of that place had held Ganon's fury for a century of centuries, but against the beast's restored strength they were reduced to powder, exposing the millions of tons of earth that stood behind them. That rush of force came back, flooding the chamber in burning devastation, and only the hero stood in the midst of it, the light of his soul and the strength of the sword allowing him to move, to hold, to fight on. Link turned and the sword flashed and the calamity's ankles collapsed as its tendons were cut, and it could not even scream for the force storm that was now blasting power upward, stripping the opening of the chamber of its lights and symbols, spewing out into the throne room and blasting every stone clear of the sanctum. The hero barely seemed to move his arm, slicing through more tendon and muscle, and the calamity fell to his knees and then onto its arms. The maelstrom howled around him and the hero moved unhindered, his feet tapping a silent rhythm against powdered stone as he rounded the calamity, the Master Sword singing, and Ganon fell as its right arm was left useless. It wouldn't heal quickly enough to continue the fight, not this time. The hero and the calamity locked eyes, as they had done countless times before. The hero breathed in, lifting the Master Sword in his hands, preparing to drive it home in another killing stroke.
"Fool!"
The calamity bubbled, its voice strained and mocking and hateful.
"All of them are already dead."
Link stabbed Ganon through its forehead. He held the Master Sword there as the beast thrashed, as the maelstrom of its power faded to nothing and less than nothing, as its adherence to this body wavered. The light of the sword grew dim, barely visible, and still he held it. Finally, Ganon's body began to burn. The hero pulled free the sword. He stepped away from the carcass, out of which burning darkness was already rising with renewed hate. He took his position, where he knew that he would see if it tried to flee, where he would be ready when it rose again. where he could see it gathering the power to break him. He sank to one knee. His limbs were shaking. He held onto the sword, refusing to fall.